All right, we'll call the meeting to order. Any changes to the agenda? Any public out there for public comment? Hearing none. Are we looking at the minutes from the last joint meeting?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to, I put it
Yeah.
on the agenda for your review.
Let's do that. Review them. Does anybody have any comments or changes to the minutes? Edits to the minutes, I should say. I'm not hearing anything. Revy, I'm assuming everyone can hear me?
Yep,
Okay.
loud and
So-
clear.
Okay, so I'm assuming it was on the agenda as an action item, so I'll take a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
Move to approve.
Is there a second?
Sure, I'll second it.
Okay. Any further discussion?
Does it matter if it's housing
I don't think I'm. It's just a formality.
Mike, I just messaged you the agenda link.
Oh. I could get up and go get my other computer, but all right, I appreciate that. You don't like me winging it, huh? So, if there's no comments, all those in favor of the motion to approve the minutes from the previous meeting, please say aye.
or? Aye.
Anyone opposed? Anyone abstaining?
Abstain.
Okay, those passed. Next, we have a presentation by the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission on Act 181 and future land use map. Who do we have, Sarah with us?
Yep, it's me, and I'm joined by Kate McCarthy as well. Cool, thanks all. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and while I'm doing that, nice to meet housing folks who I have not already met. And good to see some planning commission folks again. I have not spoken to you all in quite some time, so, this mic?
Just a little closer, yeah.
Okay. But the goal of tonight, as you may have seen in the packet, is to briefly review Act 181, which is the Act 250 reform bill that passed last year. The Planning Commission has already heard about this at the January meeting, but just want to make sure we're all speaking from the same page, so I want to make sure Affordable Housing Committee members are up to speed. So going to briefly review that, and then we will talk a little bit about regional housing targets as well. So that's the goal for this evening. Feel free to stop me and jump in if people have questions. I do tend to pause for questions as they come up, and hoping that this will be more of a discussion and exchange than anything else. But for those of you who are not at the January meeting, there might be some new information, and it can be quite dense. So trying to make it as simple as possible. And with that, Act 181 was really the legislature's way of addressing the housing crisis at a state level using a smart growth framework. So the idea of Act 181 is to make it easier to develop in areas that regional planning commissions are required to map, which is what this future land use map is that we'll talk about in later slides. And then otherwise, what Act 181 does, it does not impact the way development happens in rural areas. It does not really change much other than in these new areas that we are defining as areas that are planned for growth. So this is the state's way of really helping to identify areas at the state level that, you know, in Chittenden County, when we say an area is planned for growth, that means something different than the Northeast Kingdom or Bennington County. So the state's trying to streamline and just direct public investment in more streamlined ways using this mapping tool. So Act 181 does this by aligning local, regional, and state planning. So we are all these regional planning commissions, which you may or may not know, there's 11 throughout the state. We are all in the midst of creating these new regional future land use maps that do two things. One is they are going to modernize how Vermont maps and directs public investment. So it's replacing the current designation program with a new version of the designation program. So Winooski has a couple designations. Act 181 is changing that, and we'll talk about that in some slides that are coming up. And it's also changing Act 250's jurisdiction to being location-based instead of simply threshold-based. So Act 250 used to be triggered when a development was proposed that was more than 9 units or more than 9 acres, and now Act 250 will be triggered that same way for much of Vermont, but there are options for exemptions in areas that are planned for growth. And this change is intended to recognize that some areas of Vermont want growth, are planned for growth, have the necessary infrastructure for development, and also have sufficient municipal zoning regulations in place to regulate that development. Regional future land use mapping is not new. You are all either on an affordable housing committee or a planning commission, so you're probably familiar with future land use mapping, but what the map is on the left is the regional future land use map from 2018. In the past, Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission has developed our map pretty much purely based on zoning. And now with Act 181, there are 11 specific categories that are defined in statute that we need to use to create these regional future land use maps. And like I said, some areas that are defined in statute are correlated with the state designation program or the opportunity for Act 250 exemptions. The other
Hey,
thing that's,
Sarah?
yeah,
Sorry, I don't know if you need to do it now. I'm going to suggest maybe at some point you show us the current land use map for Winooski to see how it's shown on the regional
yeah.
plan map or whatever. But I
Yeah.
don't know if you can do it now or wait until you get the future. The draft.
I will be doing that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
And I could do it earlier in the presentation, but I want to show at least one more slide before I do that. So one more thing I just want to add is that our plans and our maps used to just be approved by the Regional Planning Commission's board, which is made up of representatives from all the municipalities, but there's this new land use review board at the state level that is now going to be reviewing our plans and our maps. And so we really want to make this map reflective of on-the-ground conditions, reflective of community goals and hopes. And then also because we are, not just because we have oversight, but also because it's in the statute, like it does need to fall in line with Act 181 definitions and regulations. So that's sort of the role that regional planning commissions are playing right now in creating these new maps. So this slide's a lot of information, but it's sort of where you see the sway that our new future land use maps will hold. The top row are the 11 new regional land use categories that we need to use, ranging from downtown centers and village centers, all the way to some more rural categories. The important thing to note here is, although there is a category for resource-based recreation, which are things like ski resorts, or enterprise, which are things like office parks, the map doesn't actually have any regulatory or sway over those areas. Where the map, like I said, holds some power is in the pinks. So if an area is mapped as a downtown center or a village center, and the Land Use Review Board approves our maps, those areas will automatically receive center designation benefits. The same is true for planned growth areas and village areas. Areas that are delineated on our maps as planned growth areas and village areas automatically will receive neighborhood designation benefits. You may or may not know there used to be 5 different state designations, so the state has tried to simplify it by making there only 2 now. Of course, it still needs to be a little complicated, so there's a couple different steps of center designations, but we don't need to dive into that unless there's burning curiosities about that. But that is, the state designation program ranges from things as simple as historic tax credits for individual property owners to areas that are eligible for investment or planning funding or water, wastewater studies, things like that. The bottom row is the Act 250 exemption opportunity. So all the areas that are mapped as pink are, the Regional Planning Commission has identified that we think they are eligible for Tier 1B, which is a partial Act 250 exemption. It's partial not because it's a partial exemption but because it's exemption for only certain criteria, so if it's less than 50 units of housing, any development that's proposed for less than 50 units of housing would be exempt from the Act 250 process. That being said, they still need to follow local regulations. So if it's proposed in a zoning district that doesn't allow that density, the local regulations still hold the sway and the power there.
Could I chime in,
Yeah,
Sarah?
please.
The other thing that still needs to happen with any development is that they need to get state permits. So wetlands permits, access, stormwater, wastewater permits. So even though Act 250, the environmental review law, is going away, those state permits are still making sure that development is safe for the environment.
Good point. And then areas that are planned growth areas or centers are also eligible for exemption for any development of any size, commercial included. So Tier 1B is just for housing and just for 50 units of less, and then Tier 1A is for any development. These exemptions currently are opt-in by the municipality, so at some point, the Planning Commission will likely, at the next meeting in May, is going to talk about what areas in Winooski they want to have Tier 1B designations. And then that will be an opt-in vote by council that will need to be made to the Regional Planning Commission for us to map it as Tier 1B. In the future, like a year or so from now, if Winooski wants Tier 1A status, that will be between Winooski and the Land Use Review Board. Regional Planning Commission will no longer be the middleman for that, option. And then just to note, for all the rest of the land use areas, Act 250, sort of a status quo will still apply. The road rule has been added back in, so for those of you who don't know what that is, that's if a single property has a driveway of more than 800 feet, Act 250 will still be triggered. That's to try to prevent habitat fragmentation. And then down in the corner, just to fully explain this image, is mysterious Tier 3, which Tier 3 is going to be added, make it harder to develop in certain areas. And these areas, we don't know what they're going to be because the Land Use Review Board is defining them, but it's likely areas like floodplains or things like that. But we're really not sure because that is happening in rooms we are not in right now.
Hey, Sarah,
Yeah,
do you want to take questions as we go, or you want us to hold them?
I was going to pause for questions here.
Oh,
Yeah.
but I am jumping in again. Can you just explain, Tier 1B, that is automatically invoked if you're in a downtown center, village center, planned growth area, and
No.
village area?
Nope.
As opposed, I'm sorry, maybe you can just explain that and versus opting in. Is it opting in for Tier 1A?
Yeah, so they're both opt-in. The areas that we have mapped as any of the pinks we consider eligible for Tier 1B, but then it is a municipal decision as to whether or not the municipality wants to have Tier 1B status. That's also true of Tier 1A, but CCRPC is not the broker between the state and the municipality for Tier 1A.
Okay, so if the municipality does not opt in, then it's subject to regular Act 250, the Act
Yeah.
250 criteria.
Exactly,
Right,
yeah.
okay.
Which kind of leads, I want to pause for additional questions, but that question kind of leads nicely into the next slide, I think. Well, I'll skip that one. Because I do just want to note that there currently are interim Act 250 exemptions for housing right now. These were put in place when Act 181 passed to not stymie housing growth while regional planning commissions got their acts together to develop these maps. So right now, what you're looking at on the screen, these are currently location-based and type-based places that are likely exempt from Act 250 as we speak. So that, I just feel like that's related to your question because if municipalities don't opt in, then we risk reducing these sort of exemptions as they currently stand. Because right now, all of Winooski is sort of mapped as potentially eligible for Act 250 exemptions. There are district coordinators who are monitoring this program, so it's not to say that Act 250 exemptions are definitely in place for all areas of Winooski, but we can look at that map too. But right now, these interim exemptions are in place. And when we sort of started off this process at the Regional Planning Commission, we kind of were hopeful that our map would not be more restrictive of development than this current interim exemption map. So that is just something that is related, I think, to your question.
So it says interim, is there any discussion or conversation about these Act 250 exemptions being permanent if a municipality does not opt in for 1B or 1A?
Good question. Do you want to jump in?
That is a good question. I don't know the answer. They're in the thick of it in Montpelier, under the Golden Dome. And there are some discussions. There is a housing bill. I haven't read a recent version. At one point, someone said, hey, what if instead of being opt-in, it's opt-out? That all municipalities do have these exemptions in place, that these interim types of exemptions continue unless a municipality requests otherwise. I don't know if that provision is advancing, but it's an example of the way people have sort of pondered this question in the policy setting. So we'll probably know more in mid-May when the legislature acts or doesn't.
Knock on wood.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And maybe if I could add another thing about these interim Act 250 exemptions, the way that some communities are thinking about this is when they are thinking about Tier 1B status, and you'll talk more about this at your next meeting, the question could be, do we wish to continue the interim Act 250 exemptions by opting into Tier 1B status? So just another way to emphasize that this is in place now. Do you want to continue it?
So that almost sounds like opting into 1B extends these exemptions. I mean, they're not exactly one-to-one, right?
Correct. They're not exactly one-to-one, but they're very similar, especially in the location, most in the location-based section. The type-based exemptions, I think that the hotel motel, one of those is continuing, but I forget which one. But
I think it's hotel motel.
yeah, hotel motel conversion may continue.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right. They are similar, but not one-to-one.
Yeah. And basically, these interim exemptions will expire either at the end of the timeline, which I forget the exact date, but once our map, for Chittenden County, they will expire once our map is adopted and approved. That will replace these interim exemptions. Do people have
And
other
that map-
questions?
That map will, the map only shows the different land use categories, right? It doesn't show if you've opted in or out?
Right now, it only shows the categories because we're in the process still, but eventually we will map the Tier 1B areas too. I'm not sure if it'll be a separate map or an overlay.
Right.
'Cause
Okay.
Some municipalities might say, we want all eligible areas to be Tier 1B. But then some municipalities will say, oh, we want north of Vermont Street to be Tier 1B, but not the rest of the planned growth area.
Great. Okay, I'll be quiet now and let anyone else ask a question. Hopefully there are some.
I think you sort of hit this, but I just want to clarify that process with the 1B. It's only whatever is identified as the purple or pink, even, or could we, as a whole municipality, just be like, no, we just want.
Well, we could go look at the map. Pretty much all of Winooski's a purple or pink.
Yeah, but
yeah.
but for a few parks, for us, I know I'm just trying to understand that
Yeah.
if like the councils could end up getting into the weeds too much or something,
Yeah.
or if it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, and if you're potentially, I don't know if this is something that would need to be approved on town meeting, but it's maybe easier to just explain like all Winooski or not all Winooski.
Yeah, and so maybe now's a good time for us to navigate over to looking at the map too. So
Sure.
get out of this presentation because it might illuminate some things. Okay, I'm sharing different screen.
The one other question I
Yeah.
had, which you may or may not have an answer for, it sounded like, but with the Tier 3, I see that you've identified green areas or conservation areas in your maps, but that's not like a guarantee that the state will then go with what is identified?
We do not anticipate it will.
Okay.
We don't know for sure, but we do not think that that's part of their plan. We think they'll be more specific and have it be more based on a specific A&R data layer, or something even more different. You have better sense than I do. But our green layer is also based on A&R data, but it's like all floodplains, all wetlands, all highest priority forest blocks, all rare, threatened, endangered species. So it's a little bit broader than what we expect.
Okay, so yours, what you've identified might be broader, you're
Yeah,
saying, than
we think
the
it'll
state
be
would
broader.
narrow it even more.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And in our assignment to map the various rural areas, the dark green rural conservation, the tealish ag forestry, and the brownish rural general, those are descriptive categories. Like Sarah said earlier, there's no regulatory implication. And so we've been operating under the assumption that the dark green areas will not be adopted as the tier 3 areas, because that's our intention. Our mapping process is not a regulatory one for the rural areas, and so they're going through their own process with a working group and A&R and many others to figure out whether and how certain areas, high-value natural resource areas, should be regulated more.
I know we don't have a whole lot of dark green areas to worry about here.
Yeah, it's still, it's probably the layers that have caused, I mean, even just looking at this map that I'm showing you right now is our commentable map.
Yeah.
They're the areas that are causing us the most grief, clearly. Like,
Oh, wow.
just because, sort of like Kate mentioned, like, they're descriptive, and so they're not like, there's no perfect data layer for us to map rural ag forestry. So people are confused because it is confusing, because right now we're using current use data, which is a tax program, not necessarily accurate of land use.
Gotcha.
But as for Winooski, this is the current draft map of it. I will say when I came in January, I believe, the Teagan Street neighborhood and this industrial area down here were mapped as planned growth areas, and that's a change that we could make to have it go back to being a planned growth area if Winooski sees any hope for, some like infill there at some point someday in the future, or if there is desire to have areas within those purple, sort of like lavender color.
Well, those are currently industrial.
Yeah, they're currently industrial, but our map is sort of up here, saying these fit the criteria. Your local future land use map is more specific, and then your zoning regulations are the actual rules and regs. So if we were to change that back to planned growth area, it would just open up those areas to be eligible for the state designation benefits and eligible for the Act 250 exemptions. So that is a decision that has been made in some other urban municipalities, like Essex Junction, for example. Global Foundries has been mapped as a planned growth area because they see there being opportunity for infill in that space.
Sure.
Not that it necessarily will happen or that it's currently zoned that way, but there is the opportunity for that, and it's served by water and wastewater and is walkable. So, yeah, if folks have opinions on that, it'll be something that we probably dive into a little bit more at the planning commission meeting in May. But I did just want to highlight that because that is a change since I last spoke with folks here. Otherwise, additional questions or comments on this map?
I see one section, I think if I'm right, there's like one little square of lighter pink that I think is where the old St. Stephen's Church parking lot is. And I see that in lighter pink as opposed with the surrounding areas, the darker. Is there a reason, or what is the decision on that line?
Could you, where?
Oh, sorry.
Right
I
there?
think that's probably because of zoning.
Is it just zoning?
What, I think the
Yeah.
center is based purely on Winooski's current designation as
Right.
center, and so I guess that section is not included in the current designation as a center, and then everything else is considered planned growth
Yeah.
because it's all walkable and water, sewer, things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sarah, I think, and Rebbe can correct me, I think that St. Stephen's property is in a residential zone as opposed to the other ones are in I think a C1 zone.
That's correct,
Okay.
yes.
That sounds right.
Question in the chat. Has there been review of compatibility? If the question of has there been review of compatibility, if you're talking about is this map compatible with Winooski's current zoning and current map, the answer is yes. But if you have more details on, if that did not answer your question, let me know.
Looking at change of use and compatibility with change of use.
For change of use, yeah, so right now, this map is not really changing anything. It's just kind of mapping what already, honestly, it's mapping what already exists in Winooski, and by mapping it this way, it's allowing Winooski to opt in to the Act 250 exemptions if Winooski wants, and also continuing continuing and actually expanding the designation benefits that Winooski is able to see, because it does, mapping all of Winooski as a planned growth area does expand current benefits a little bit.
It sounds like the answer is no
Sorry,
in this case.
so no, I don't think I'm understanding your question. Could you repeat your question?
In terms of change of use from industrial to residential, has there been review of compatibility? You answered that this map is not looking at changes, and then you say it could potentially be changes, but that basically answers the question that no, there hasn't been a review of compatibility from industrial to residential.
Oh, as far as the suitability for a given industrial site to be converted, and in what time frame and with what sort of environmental remediation? Is that kind of what you mean? Yeah. So that's a great point and a really important part of the longer term land use planning. And it reminds me of a point that I like to make in these presentations, which is while our map is sort of a high level look at what could be possible, what is on the ground as well as what's possible for the future, the specifics of what happens in any given neighborhood or on any given parcel still very much remains at the local level. So say, we've got some dark purple there in the center and the corridors. That dark purple could mean 10 units an acre, it could mean 20 units an acre, but our purple isn't telling you that. That's however you choose to implement that through your own local land use regulations or investments. That's what makes the actual change on the ground. And the same would be true if the city wanted to move toward redevelopment of any particular area of town. The specifics of that would be figured out at the city level.
Okay, thank you. For those not familiar, my name's Bryn, I'm on the city council, so happy to have a little bit more discussion on this before it comes to council, just, so we don't get too far in the weeds, as Robert mentioned.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bryn. Sarah, let me ask you, Sarah, what's the difference between the orange, which I think is transitional area, and the lavender color? And I ask because I noticed that Hercules Drive, which is kind of a mix of commercial, it's primarily industrial, but some commercial up there too, is in the orange, while Tigan Street is in the lavender.
Yeah, so the lavender areas are easier to describe. They are the enterprise areas, so that is primarily industrial areas, office parks, quarries in some of the more rural areas, or I guess even here in Colchester. Yeah, literally there. Yeah, so those are a little bit more defined. The orange is probably the least well-defined land use category on the map. The transition area, the way we have kind of been thinking about it and talking about it, these are areas that need additional planning to know what they want to be. So some of them might eventually become planned for growth, some of them might become enterprise, but right now they don't necessarily have the infrastructure needed to have growth. They might not have water or wastewater, they might not have sidewalks, but they also are not rural either. So sprawly type areas, or areas that we just quite don't know exactly what to do with, are often the transition areas right now. So these are areas that municipalities should note to, discuss and talk about in the future. There's not a ton on our map. If we zoom out, it's a very small land use category, because there's a lot of good planning work that's been done in Chittenden County. Kate, would you add anything to that?
That's a good explanation. I guess what I would add is that those transition areas bring some focus to those areas for that planning and for investment. And the Regional Planning Commission can support some of that with some of our planning dollars. So knowing that a town is interested in putting some work in is also helpful to us at the regional level as we plan out our work plans. And one thing to say about transition and enterprise both is that when it comes to Act 250, there are no special benefits. Those fall into the status quo Tier 2 area.
Thank you.
Could you explain, like, in the future, what the amendment process would be with CCRPC for the map?
Such a good question. We're still talking about that, working that out. Because typically, like municipalities, we only update our regional plan once every 8 years. However, there are many instances throughout the county where we are sort of hearing conversations or anticipating that there might be a need and desire to have like late Tier 1B opt-ins or late switches. So we're talking about how to do that, and I don't know if it's going to need to be an amendment to our bylaws to be able to open just like this one section of our regional plan without having to reopen the whole darn thing. So we're in the middle of talking about that right now. Right now, we're hoping to have this version all sort of wrapped up. So all Tier 1B requests in and things like that by July this year, so that we could adopt this plan winter time, springtime of next year. But we're still talking about how we're going to do amendments. Yeah.
You're not the first to ask. It's an important question, and we intend to find a way. The Land Use Review Board is also going through its process right now to figure out how they're going to take in and review regional plans, and they're contemplating how they might accept Tier 1B requests outside of the regional planning process. So it's on their mind as well, so that there can be that flexibility for cities and towns.
These are all great questions.
I have one more question, actually. Would there be any value to not opting into the Tier 1B for Winooski generally? Like, is there I know that maybe isn't the right question for you, but are there certain things, basically it would be reviewed by Act 250? Is that a benefit?
That's a good question. There are some things that Act 250 reviews that may or may not be in your regulations, like RKO or like blasting requirements, things like that. I'm not familiar with Winooski's regulations enough to let you know what those are, but I would anticipate it being a benefit, at least for Winooski, to do Tier 1B. Tier 1A, I don't know as much. Well, that could be continued more at the next Planning Commission meeting if folks are interested. But at this time, if there's no more questions, we could sort of transition to talking about housing targets, if that sounds cool with folks.
Sounds good.
Cool. So just pulling back up this presentation. My computer's ahead. We've already talked about all this bit. We talked about the tiers. We could talk more about the tiers later. Right, so when Kate and I were talking about this meeting, Kate had made the really great suggestion to acknowledge that Winooski has really been a leader when it comes to housing production in the county. There's been a lot of wins that you are all way more familiar with than I would be, but just did want to acknowledge that Winooski has among the highest per capita housing growth in Chittenden County from the past 5 years, especially along Main Street. There's been tons of new houses that have been added. You already have a bunch of designations, so we want to keep those benefits sort of rolling in with the new regional future land use map, like we were just talking about. There has been proactive use of local funds to support low-income housing with different partners. There's been a lot of work to have some forward-thinking zoning, such as enabling more smaller lots and reduced parking minimums. And I know that there was the equitable housing needs assessment that happened or is happening. The housing work reflects anti-displacement goals. So just wanted to give you all some kudos before talking a little bit more about these regional housing targets. This is a bad slide, but this just basically shows that not actually last year in 2003, when the Home Act originally passed, regional planning commissions were tasked with dispersing municipal housing targets. So the statewide housing needs assessment happened. It was published this winter, and in that statewide housing needs assessment, the state gave all the regions different housing targets for the years 2030 and 2050. And as you can see on this bolded text, Regional Planning Commissions shall disaggregate regional housing targets or ranges by municipality. So just wanting to ground us in, that is why CCRPC has gone about assigning housing targets. How were numbers assigned to each city and town? So we worked with our Planning Advisory Committee, which is made up of representatives from planning departments across the county or planning commissions for those municipalities that don't have staff. So Revy is a member of our Planning Advisory Committee. And we talked about a couple of different methodologies on how to assign housing targets to each city and town in Chittenden County. And this is sort of the methodology that was landed on after a lot of back and forth. The 4 cities in Chittenden County receive 60% of the regional housing target, divided by land area. So South Burlington's going to get a bigger target than Winooski. And then the rural towns are receiving a small 3.8% of the regional housing target. However, for all of those rural towns, that is still increasing their housing stock by 20% by 2050 for the middle value that was given. And then the mixed urban rural towns are receiving the remaining about 40% of the regional housing target. And that is the way those targets were distributed is based on the future land use map that we just looked at. So the planned growth areas in Williston or the planned growth areas in Heinsberg, those areas are weighted to get those numbers. I think I missed the punchline by saying we are talking about mostly 2050 targets because as planners, that is what we're looking towards the future. As we know, any housing that's going to be built by 2030 kind of already needs to be in the development pipeline. While that number still exists and while there is immense urgency to build and build now, we're focusing on 2050 because that's what we feel we have some more control over or could talk and plan around. And that 2050 number for Chittenden County, I don't know the exact number, but is between 15,783 and 47,407 new housing units in the county. It's a giant range. The low target seems incredibly doable. In fact, it decreases, or it doesn't really increase our rate of production currently. The high target feels really, really high. So we're kind of looking a little bit at the middle target, but that has been the process. And these are the targets. This is a lot of information on the screen, but we like to show them all at the same time to sort of show that not Charlotte, if you want to get rid of 50 targets in your unit, those 50 targets are going to need to go someplace else. So you can see here, we're going to talk about the middle number just because it's an easier number to talk about. You can see the total units in this column and then the percent growth that would be compared to the existing housing units in 2023. And then over here on the right, this is the annual historic growth rate in the past 20 years. And it just is kind of comparing to hit those middle targets or those low targets or those high targets. This is what the annual growth rate would have to be. So these targets are pushing all the municipalities to have a higher annual growth rate than they have in the past. That's not necessarily true of the low targets. And these are the numbers. These numbers will need to be included in any municipal plan going forward, and there needs to be talk about what the municipality is doing to enable this housing to be developed, but the state does not expect municipalities to become developers. And to be honest, there's no stick to enforce this yet. At this point, it's a big effort at the state's part to just collect better data on what is being built and what is not being built in Vermont. We've collected that data in Chittenden County for a decade now, but statewide, there's no real record of what is being built. So that's part of the impetus to have these housing targets. Yeah, any questions?
Does this take into account types of housing unit, at all?
Great question. It does not. That is something that we will need to do regionally. So we are going to need to disaggregate our regional number based on type, affordability, size, even location. But we have not disaggregated the municipal targets, and we're sort of in conversation about like how and if that is going to happen. But especially in a place like Winooski, you all have likely way better data than we do on what how you have multiple housing needs assessments. So we think in places like this, you will all have done a potentially better job than we would in having to sort of do a regional housing needs assessment for a municipality to say like, oh, Winooski, you need this much affordable housing or whatnot. But I do think we will be doing that sort of analysis at the regional level, and then we can provide those averages and say like, regionally, we know that this percentage needs to be affordable to meet our population's demand. This is what your local average is. You could compare and think about what your community really needs at that level. We're having those conversations right now, so I'm trying to figure that out.
Well, and forgive me if you answer my question. I'm also not just talking about affordability, but like rental versus owning
Yeah.
versus single
Yeah.
family versus duplex.
Yeah, I'm lumping that all in.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we these are just total unit numbers.
Yeah.
So yeah, only so useful.
So Bryn has a question.
Yeah, hi again. I have not been following the conversation at the State House, so perhaps I don't know if you'll cover it in your presentation here or have insights, discussions at that level. I'm curious if any consideration has gone into public service needs and support for services like regional dispatch and how that overlays with the increase in housing goals?
That is a good question. Do you want to take that? I mean, so as it connects to housing targets, I don't think there has been conversation at the state level about that I know about. But when we are sharing these numbers, those are questions that we're hearing. Like, oh, if our population is going to increase by this much, will we need to expand our school? Will we need more police? So those conversations are definitely being sparked at the local level. And I think that is almost that element along with infrastructure is sort of part of the intent of these housing targets is for regions and cities and towns to have those hard conversations about, we know we need this much more housing. What is it going to take to make that happen? Is that going to take a mound sewer system in a more rural area? Is like, if that's what it needs, like what do we need to get in place to start making that happen so that we can build this housing by 2050? And I think that ties into social services as well. So like sort of services and infrastructure, this is meant to sort of spark those conversations, I think.
Okay, thanks.
If I can kind of pick up a little bit on Bryn's question, I was going to ask you, you said there's no stick in terms of enforcement for these numbers. What if a municipality decides, looks at it and says, geez, we can't afford to have this much because the services have to double or whatever. Do the municipalities have any leeway in changing those numbers, or this is state imposed and that's what you get?
Yeah, so technically we're open for public comment right now about these numbers. So that's kind of that, I'll say that off the bat. But I think in sharing all these numbers together and just like talking through our methodology, there's no perfect way to do this. And also because there is no real stick. If municipalities are like, we simply can't do this, so we're gonna aim for the low number, we can't really control that at this point. I think it's just like we share all these numbers together to say like, hey, like if you're only gonna hit this low number, where are the remaining 200 housing units going to go? Like if they're not gonna go in this town, what town are they gonna go in when we know we need them? And these numbers were come up, I don't have this included in this slideshow, but the State Housing Needs Assessment has sort of a bar chart breakdown of how the numbers were come up with. And that bar chart breakdown shows that these are houses, these numbers account for houses that are lost to, just aging out and falling apart, to regulate the housing market to get that vacancy rate up to 6%, which is considered a healthy housing market, and to account for our growing population and to address the homelessness crisis. And that's sort of the lower number. And then the higher number is doing all those things plus accounting for some additional in-migration in case all the projections about climate migration moving to Vermont come into effect, or if another COVID happens and there's a mad rush to the rural areas. So that's sort of one of the differences between the low numbers and the high numbers. And when you sort of think about these numbers like that, it's hard to argue that the housing is not needed. So if we know the housing is needed, at least the low numbers, it's got to go somewhere. Where do we put it?
So it sounds like then, whatever numbers that, we've got the number that the state gave for the county, and the PAC distributed them amongst the municipalities. So, I mean, we basically, this is it. If we don't meet it, well, we don't meet it, right? Like you said, there's no stick at this point.
Yeah.
I just want to clarify, I understood what you last said, Sarah, that the low target brings us the vacancy rate we need and addresses homelessness and current rate of growth.
Yeah.
And so the middle and higher targets assume increased growth in the state.
Sorry.
So we're peeking at the report
housing
itself.
Yeah.
The lower target would be basically status quo. It does not have a strong impact, as I read it, on homelessness. It's at the mid and the higher levels that there would be more impacts. We can share this housing needs assessment afterwards. How do I want to put this? I'm just going to read it to you. At the lower level, according to VHFA, the Vermont Housing Finance Agency's assessment, the policy implications, like what do we get at these different levels? So at the lower level, requires an average annual rate of housing growth statewide of 0.8%, which is an increase. Housing is growing at less than 0.8% right now. The labor market would be likely to remain unchanged. So as far as having housing to bring in workers to fill jobs, which is talked about a lot. If the number of households grows beyond that expected under the scenario, vacancy rates would be below normal levels, unhealthy, and housing costs and homelessness would be pressured upwards. So there's not a lot of room for flex at the low end, is how I read that. Whereas, yeah.
That's important. And then I just want to add on something that Councilor Oakley had brought up. We had 14% population growth over the last 2 censuses. We have about 1% growth a year for the years that I've been involved. And it has been challenging to keep up with services, infrastructure. I find the high number on here not feasible to do sustainably. Even the middle number, I think, is a bit of a challenge. But I think that I appreciate that context of where that data point comes from.
Yeah.
Because it is not sustainable to continue with this vacancy rate and this homelessness problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think that as we go around and have these conversations with our municipalities, we're going to be getting really good questions and hearing reflected back to us the realities of what the experience of growth has been like thus far, and what more growth would cause or require. And I think I hope that can be a conversation that continues between municipalities, RPCs, and the legislature, so that they can hear back, oh, okay, so towns our cities and towns are generally okay with these housing targets, but they're really worried about schools, or they're really worried about dispatch. And then the legislature might say, okay, what are some of the solutions? I hope the legislature would say, here are some of the solutions. We're hearing that in order to meet the housing targets. And so there can just be that kind of evolution of policy and investment as these targets, as a focus for conversation, raise the questions.
Just to confirm one thing, so these, not the percentages, like the numbers of units, this is like actual numbers of units, so it's not like St. George is not 3,140, right? There's literally currently 314 units of housing.
Yeah,
that's correct.
In St. George.
That's right.
And so these annual numbers, it's like low for Winooski would be 27 units per year, 53 units added per year, 80
Yeah.
units added
Yeah.
per
Yeah.
year.
Yep,
Yeah.
those are units, not percentages.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
You got
not, it's not like 24,000.
No. There's literally 314 houses, yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's an important clarification, thank you.
There's 12 houses in Buell Score.
Not a typo.
I think just one thing that sticks out to me about this is we're in a unique situation in Winooski in that we just have such little open land. Like the only way for us to really build more housing to some extent is to build up, right? Or to replace current single-family duplex, et cetera, with like bigger apartment buildings, right? And that makes us different from almost every other town in Vermont to some extent. And I think, I understand at some level, the Regional Planning Commission is tied by what the state has decided to do. And to some extent, a lot of the concern, or another way you can think is the excuse, is, well, there's a lack of infrastructure in more rural areas. I do think Vermont has plenty of space, and some of our more rural, semi-rural communities need to step up more, and that should be thought of very, very carefully in this process. And I'm a pro-growth person in general, but like we only have so much space in Winooski in particular.
Yeah, thanks for that comment, yeah.
We're hoping that in the rural areas, even though it's a very small rate of growth, we are hoping that it is an opportunity to have conversations about infrastructure, village wastewater, which we know can be quite complicated and feel like a big lift for a small community, but is a way to promote village vitality, to promote housing, to promote aging, and not just aging in place, but aging in community, which are things that are important everywhere. So, every place is going to reach these targets or aim for the targets in a different way. We hope they have the conversations, make the investments.
Bryn?
Yeah, this reminds me how there's been a number of joint housing planning meetings the last 6 months or so. And I think it was the one in October, November, where you had the developers present, and many of them were sitting on projects. I'm curious if there's been any analysis of if, with the reduction of this Act 250 oversight, how much money is saved by developers, and I know it's kind of project dependent, but I'm curious how much money would be saved by developers, and if that would actually move the needle enough to spark the development on projects that we know already are kind of in limbo.
I'm not an Act 250 expert, but like, for example, we know that a 48 unit development in Bolton, the Act 250 permit fee was $120,000. So that's not nothing. It's only 48 units, or it is 48 units, so divided amongst all those. But I mean, I think the state is hoping that this will reduce that. Will encourage developers to have one less, not just one less hurdle, but one less financial constraint on a project.
Yeah, and I would add to that there's removing the financial barrier. For many developers have said that having to go through Act 250 increases uncertainty in their process, and so removing uncertainty is a cost savings as well as a psychological savings. Just makes it easier to get through, and there may also even be a threshold question there of I heard a developer presenting a couple weeks ago who has done is starting a project in Middlebury. And that developer basically said, if it's not within one of these designated areas, which is the program we have now for Act 250 exemptions, we're not even going to look at it. So the absence of Act 250 could make certain parcels appealing for development that otherwise would not be. So it might just even get them in the door, cost savings aside.
Gotcha. I think I was just thinking of that as how much that predictability and reduction in permit fees would factor into overall project cost reduction compared to inflation, tariffs, all those other constraints, labor challenges. So just, again, curious how much analysis might be out there considering all the current events that we know of.
I'll just add a couple data points on this that
Yeah,
I shared
great.
with you. So looking at just old jurisdictional orders and Act 250 permits from the last 10 years, we've had 8 exempted projects, 6 of which were carried out. So that's 137 units currently and 92 units in progress over the last 10 years. A couple of these projects were LIHTC projects. In comparison, we've got 6 Act 250 projects, 5 of which were carried out, so 71 units and 83 units in progress. So the current exemptions in place before the interim exemptions that exempted priority housing projects, which were basically what included 20% affordable housing at 100% of the area median income. This is something that was an incentive that developers did go for and could take that cost compared to Act 250 costs, meaning that option is cheaper than Act 250 permits. And so the Act 250 permit process, for most projects, it ends up being at least 6 figures. And then it goes up considerably more, especially as you go outward into greenfields for remediation for prime ag or any sort of wetlands permits that are involved. So the breakdown that I'm trying to get at is that yes, Act 250 can provide a significant reduction in costs to the point that it can accommodate affordable housing in its place and ends up being cheaper than the Act 250 permit itself.
That's really awesome data insight. Thanks, Ravi.
But then to your question about tariffs and workforce and labor shortages and all that, we have not done that analysis, but it is scary times. Any other questions or comments about this? If not, we had a couple just discussion questions, ideas for you all to sort of spark additional thoughts that you might have, but also want to be respectful of everyone's time. So that's kind of the information we came to share with you all. Like I mentioned, I'll be back in May to talk specifically about Tier 1B and like look at the future land use map one more time with the Planning Commission before hopefully approaching council for any opt-ins to Act 250 exemptions. And those are the housing targets as they stand. There can be more information found about them on our website and a little form if you want to like share some thoughts after this. But otherwise, that's all the information we have to share. So would love to hear from you if these questions spark any additional thoughts or feelings about the housing targets. Yeah.
Great. Before you leave, does anyone on the Housing Commission or Planning Commission or Council, these questions raise any other questions for you or any other comments you want to share or questions you want to ask? Bryn.
I mean, you don't need to nudge me or ask me twice. I definitely think that there's a need to just consider the additional infrastructure and support services needed for the additional housing. So from regional dispatch, our police department, our fire department, but other things like childcare, and looking at the holistic elements that help make a community thrive. So you can have housing goals, but if you're not thinking about the other elements, then things will languish.
Yeah, appreciate that comment, definitely.
Yeah, the thing I keep coming back to is the land constraints in our community. I'm a supporter of building housing as dense as anyone, but there is a real challenge of that mid target is, 1,300 homes in an area that, as I look at the areas that are most developable in Winooski, they're just not there necessarily. So I'm curious to see how we would actually get to that number conceivably, and I wonder how that could be shared. I know that obviously South Burlington, their targets are significantly higher because of the amount of space they have, but they do have a lot more developable space than just about anyone here. So I just wonder if there's a better way to share that number across the larger load-bearing communities on this list.
Yeah, definitely. And that's also kind of part of why we want to start off by saying you all have done a lot of great work in Winooski already. But I think these numbers are encouraging everybody to think creatively, including us. So, yeah.
Anyone else? No? I guess not. Well, thank you,
Oh, there was one
Sarah
more.
and Kate, for your presentation.
Sorry, Mike.
But
To the extent that you are engaged at all with legislators, towns need more money from the state for roads, for stormwater, wastewater, for public transit. Like, we cannot afford all of the services that are required to support this. And we know we have a very specific need for affordable family-size units here. We know developers aren't going to build that on their own. And so we need subsidy for that type of housing as well.
The answer to number 2 is money.
More land.
Land and money.
Yeah, I think, and this is part of my why my question too was about types of units. I don't think any of us want to just have all of our housing become block buildings like we have in the gateways. And I think to the extent that we're looking to build more and meet these targets, I think, we need to think a lot about smart infill in the residential areas and trying to have more triplexes, quadplexes, where we might currently have single family, but it's still a lot. I think we're in a unique position as a town, as a city, right, compared to even the rest of Chittenden County, and it's a challenge.
I think my takeaway is we need to clearly be very aggressive in the gateways, like in terms of what we build there, if we're going to come close to this number. But to the extent that we can meet it, it has to be in,
Right.
adjusting the use in the neighborhoods.
You probably know that there's a word for the type of housing that you're describing, the missing middle.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's used to refer to affordability, but really it's a set of housing types. And yeah, especially in our existing historically built out cities and towns, that kind of gentle infill conversion can really go a long way.
okay, anything else?
Thank you all so much for your time and participation. I will also drop, I dropped a link in the chat to the state housing needs assessment. For those of you online, I'll also drop a link to 2 of our web pages where you could submit comments or about both the future land use map and the housing targets. You all could directly contact us, but if there's other folks in your community who you want to share information with, there's a lot of information on those web pages.
Great.
Otherwise, I will see some of you the first week of May.
Right. Thank you very much. We
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Yeah,
And we'll see you in a couple weeks.
sounds good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. So next item is just other business. Is there any other business? Except for, our next planning commission meeting is it May 12th? Do I have that date
Eighth.
right?
May
What's
8th.
that? May 8th. Wow, that's close. If I'm within a week, I'm pretty good.
Yeah. So during that meeting, Sarah and Kate will come back and talk about Tier 1B, talk about the maps in more detail, right?
We'll just get a little bit more nitty gritty. And you have to talk about a strategy for bringing it to council.
Mhm. Yeah. And then we'll have the public hearing for IC.
And the next Housing Commission meeting is May 27th.
And I will invite anyone on the Housing Commission that wants to sit in on our Planning Commission meeting. You're more than welcome, as always. Okay, if there's no other business, I'll look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Is there a second?
A second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed wants to stick around longer?